A series of orange lamps pass overhead, temporarily dispelling the darkness on the road ahead. It's cold and damp, an attribute common of the town at 3 in the morning, but I didn't know that, as it is my first time traversing outside of my home at such an hour. I pedaled my bike down barren roads, throwing up streaks of water from the rear tire every time I passed over shallow puddles, which were hidden in the dark of night, until the quick reflection of the moon shined on their surface, warning me of their presence at the very last moment. By then it was too late, and even my thick sweatshirt was unable to hold back the wet feeling of the water soaking into its fabric. The town remained silent as the roads were empty of the passing cars. The walkways were abandoned by the treading feet, and the backyard barbecues were long out of propane. A few porch lights were left on, making a cozy welcoming to any late-night trespassers, while the rest of the house was cloaked in the shadows of night, showing no sign of any activity within. It was just I and the occasional passing lights above. I pressed on with exhausting speeds. Even though I was in no rush, I had time, or so I had convinced myself, but the racing adrenaline seemed to help fuel my mind into remembering the turns and directions I needed to take. The faster pace felt necessary, as I was more familiar with the scenery when it passed by in a rapid blur. The slow pace of my bike made it feel that I had too much time on the designated road, and that I was riding into the wrong direction. I would look over my shoulder, wondering if I had passed the turn that I was supposed to make, until I caught sight of a landmark I had committed to memory, indicating the correct turn to take. I had never took into consideration how hard it would be to see such things in the night. A part of me didn't want to make this trip alone. The night was a scary place that croaked with unusual sounds, which always came from the darkest corners. Even though my abnormal sensory to hear, the inner workings of the mind had told me there was only simple creatures in that direction. The initial strike of the foreign sounds were still very much startling. I was tempted to go to Dylan's house to try and wake him up, and see if he'd be willing to join me on my adventure. I was sure that he'd protest, but he always gave in after a few minutes of arguing. I just wasn't sure that I could keep him safe, and so I had to do this alone, despite not wanting to. A light shone in the distance, and a car packed full of teenagers drove by at half the speed limit, all who were cautiously minding their surroundings. They pressed their faces up against the windows as they stared at me with ghostly eyes. I passed by with all haste, paying little attention to them, until a police cruiser came by some distance behind the party-packed car. I sat down on the seat, breathing heavily, and inadvertently swaying my bike into the road as I tried to keep my mind on the course ahead. I pulled back my hood, giving my head some fresh air and allowing my ears to hear the night more keenly, and more importantly, the approaching police vehicle. The officer came from behind, his quiet engine standing out noticeably in the silent night. A great white beam fired out of the driver's side window and blinded my sight of the vehicle, temporarily passing over me and revealing my path ahead. I wish I had light like that attached to the front of my handlebars. I was forced to slow down and put my foot out to the ground in order to bring my bike to a stop. My arm instinctively raised into the air to shelter my eyes as the police cruiser slowly pulled up next to me. I am not here. The vehicle continued to roll at a slow pace. Its searchlights swiveled up and down the sidewalks and across the front yards of the nearby homes. The car soon pulled up to me, its windows were rolled down, and I saw the driver leaning into his front windshield trying to get a better view of what his light was revealing to him. Distorted voices spoke gibberish code back and forth over the interior radio, and the dashboard, full of fun flickering lights, were grabbing at my kiddish attention. The officer had seen nothing. The searchlight was switched off, and the cop car picked up speed, disappearing into the night's fog. I lifted my feet from the ground, placing them back into the pedals as I pulled my hood over my head again. I was shivering as my wet sweatshirt no longer provided the warmth it once had. The terrors of the night only grew, as I continued out of the densely populated roads and pedaled further towards the outskirts of the town. The roadway carved right through the center of a forest, where feral sensations of wildlife beckoned at me from every direction. The same afflictive fear that I was feeling was thrown right back at me, but from a multitude of different creatures that thought it safe to lurk out into the old paved road during the night hours. I was a greater threat to them than they were to me, but despite that logic, I slowed my pace, as I grew uneasy over all the sounds coming from the forest, and the mixture of primal instincts. I wanted to get through there as fast as possible, but the loud whizzing of my tires muffled the sounds of any approaching dangers, and the lack of streetlights made it impossible to stay on the road at such speeds. Driving headfirst into a bush provided very little comfort in such a situation. I pushed down on the cranks, propelling myself forward, aware of my surroundings. My shoulders were shrugged tight to my body, and I brought the bike into the center of the road, the greatest distance from the forest perimeter. Sudden potholes would cause a jolting sense of alertness, and the uneven groves of tar that coated the long-forgotten road were convincingly like tree roots in a far-off forest trail. There were times I doubted I was still on pavement. There was no end to the road. Not a single car passed by to remind me that civilization was within reach, nor was there any working street lamps that brought the warming comfort of synthetic light. Even the changing elevation of the road spoke of its distance from the human life as it slowly conformed back to the inconsistent terrain of the earth, and the sloping roads shuffled my balance from one side to the other, generating an equal sickness to that of being out in sea. I knew I had to be on the right road, as there were no wrong turns to take, assuming that I was still actually on road. It was just one long highway out of town, and so I pedaled, without looking back, and only my destination in mind. About around the time I had just grown comfortable around the wildlife that surrounded my every angle, a side of the road had cleared away, and the dense forests were replaced by an open sand dune. The sand pits were blue, illuminated by the moon that loomed overhead, and I had no trouble seeing here. I hopped off my bike and walked it across the unstable terrain, knowing I would not fare well with the narrow tires in the deep sands. The sounds of wildlife was quiet, except for the ambience of the crickets, who found home within the sand pits, just as comforting as any forest. The small shack was barely visible, but for the large yellow bus that glowed under the moonlight, right by the side of the tiny home that belonged to Grover, the bus driver. I stopped by the side of the bus, looking up into its high windows with a sense of euphoria. Even though it had only been a few days ago since I last rid within its hull, Betsy, old Grover would call her, and she sure had character. Having taken the abuse from Grover over the years, Betsy looked nothing short of a rally car in the midst of a demolition derby. The rear bumper was hanging but a few inches from the ground, while shards of crusted paint flared off to the side like brake wings designed to slow down the fast speeds the bus all too often endured. The tires flattened off near the bottom, showing the lack of air within their tubes, and the side door was wide open as though the bus longed for the return of its pilot. The sharp pitch of a dog's bark snapped me back to focus, and I remembered what my objective was. I looked around, looking to see where the sound had come from, and I drew the assumption that the dog was locked within the trailer, alongside sleeping Grover. Such loud and harsh barks were guaranteed to wake him. After a second bark, I knew the dog had somehow caught scent of me, and I shrieked at its terrible howl, and the thought that it would wake up Grover at any minute. "Be quiet," I had thought with rising anxiety and with the intensity of coursing adrenaline. The entire area went silent. The chirping songs of the crickets, the shuffling of small mammals, and the hooting of distant owls all came to cease. After around 10 seconds of absolute silence, the ambience came back, one by one, starting from the furthest distance from me. Before long, the entire place was filled with the noise of night again. The dog remained silent, and that was all I cared for. I leaned my bike up against Betsy, which was closer to the main road and would make for an easy escape had I needed to get away. Running across the few yards of sand that separated Grover's trailer from the bus, I kept to a low crouch, as though there were lookouts atop his home. Reaching the corner of the trailer, I pressed my ear up against its cold metallic surface, as though I could hear what was going on inside. Really, I was just trying to get a little closer, where the sensation of feeling was at its strongest. The racing heartbeat of a dog could be felt through the walls, and I could feel the hound as it stood eagerly at the front door, in hostile posture, awaiting the entry of the intruder it had smelt since the moment I had arrived. The dog held its tongue, fighting against instinct to voice its concern to its owner, but it could not overcome the power of the command that told it to remain silent. "Sleep." The dog dropped, its limbs from crashing in front of the door, its limp form crashing in front of the door. I nearly bit down on my tongue, wondering if there was another way I could get in, as surely opening the door would wake the dog, despite my insistence for it to sleep. I ran around the outside of the trailer, peeking into the dark interior through ripped screen windows, which hadn't a large enough opening for me to get through. I felt the corners of the narrow screens, trying to see if there was a way for me to slip in, but I lacked any talent in breaking and entering. It was all beginning to feel hopeless, and I began to think I wasted a long trip out this way. I retreated back to the bus, climbing into its dark chambers and sat in the seat Dylan and I had bonded in over the years, looking out into the blue aura of the sands. I thought to myself what foolish nonsense had brought me all the way out here. Then I remembered that I dragged myself out into this desert land just because I needed proof. The proof that I really was what my mother believed. That I could do extraordinary things, like the men of the past, like the old religious tales of prophets and heroes, the ones who could change the world, always for the better, in the name of a god. Maybe that was it, the key to it all. I needed a name to go under, some kind of deity to represent. There had never been a long-lasting tale of a man with unnatural abilities who had never served a faith, or at least not one that I could recall in my limited education. It all didn't matter, as there was no way for me to get into the house, and thus my opportunity to prove what was at a standstill. I wanted to believe in it all, that I could do the miraculous things David had said I could do, that I could heal like this idol Jesus could. I didn't necessarily think of the obligations or potential responsibilities that came with it. I just wanted to see if I could do it. If I could, then perhaps there was a meaning behind all the torment I was constantly put through, a reason to the hell that plagued me in the night, and maybe even a cure for the wretched and cursed form my mother took. If I could heal, then I knew it couldn't be true. Then it all wouldn't be because of me. The oceans would not boil, the lands would not rot, and mankind would not burn if only I could heal. It all would be one big lie, and I needed that proof. I sat back into the seat, clamping shut my eyes, feeling the edge of tiredness and slumber on the horizon. I knew it was the perfect balance between the two. It took longer than I had expected, but patience was on my side, and after 10 minutes of hard meditation, the world shook violently, and I opened my eyes, feeling the vibrations pulling at me from every angle. It felt as though I stretched out like a liquid hitting the floor, reaching out into all directions to encompass as much ground as possible in the grip of gravity. I pulled tight, trying to stay in one place, and my essence shaped into a human form, something that I was most familiar with. I passed through the walls of the bus and headed towards the trailer with great speed, feeling as though my time in this state was limited. The thin walls of the trailer passed by in an instant, and I was circulating through the room, hovering above a sleeping dog that blocked the front door. An opened can of beans with the can opener still latched onto its top was placed next to the dog bowl, and glass bottles that hung from the small kitchen's roof on strings clacked from an incoming draft. An old sweater was laid flat in one corner, layered heavily with dog furs, and open cabinets showed off dust-stained glasses and chipped china from the inside. Grover's unconscious form was on a narrow, twin-sized mattress, with his foot draping off the side, and his large, open hand slapped down onto his face. He snored like a hibernating bear, and was dressed in the same clothing he typically wore when driving the bus. As I hovered closer to Grover, the air waked with turbulence, and strange colors radiated from his sleeping form. His thoughts were quiet, and his ambitions were silent. His mind was lost, far out of the unfathomed depths of deep sleep, and it felt as though something was keeping him there. He was dreamless, as he was no longer in control of his imaginative mindset, and dwelling on that thought for but a moment caused the vague conjuration of a demonic figure to appear before me. It could have just been vapors, as strange mnemonic lights flowed around the inside of the trailer, but I couldn't believe that, not when I heard what distinctively was a warning for me to leave Grover alone. Looking into Grover's wide open and snoring mouth, I leaned in, lifting myself into the air, and fell headfirst into his mind. Flames curled around my image, a soaring orange ball of fire swirling before my head, like an arrow's tip as I crashed through the atmosphere with blinding speeds. The world was dawning on me, or more so, I was falling towards it. I went to reach up with my arms as though I could block the impending impact into the ground, but the force I was traveling at refused to allow my limbs to move, and I had hit the ground, head first, in a scattering explosion. When the light of the impact had faded, I was on my feet in the center of a massive crater, among a desert with no end. When I had climbed out of the dried and crusted ground of the crater, I was among the loose tides of sand, which was blown around by the warm winds of the air. Great dust storms could be seen in the distance, but they dare not approach I, and the land I stood upon remained silent, the winds running in the other direction. I walked into a direction, picked entirely at random, for there was no discerning characteristic regarding which way I went. With every step I took in the desert lands, creatures around 50 yards ahead of me dug their crab-like bodies out of the sand and ran into wide directions, burying themselves again under loose turf when they reached the certainty that I was not approaching that direction. Great birds flew high above, heeding close attention that they did not fly over my shadow. They cawed in eager intent as they desired to feed off of the revealing crab-like creatures, but their struggling will deterred them from landing within any distance of my sight. There was nothing around me, but for the massive, brownish scab that rose from the ground like a great dome. It sat far on the horizon, the only distinctive feature or object in this barren desert. I knew it was where I had to go. I walked carelessly through the silent sands, growing accustomed to the scattering creatures before me. Buried headstones and honorable statues were layered in seas of sand, long rotted by what must have been acidic rains that had once fallen on these lands. They were buried memories, destroyed by the harsh environment that dawned on this world. With a blink of the eye, I saw a flash of the brilliant civilization that once had lived here. Something had brought these storms, and with them, the memories had been erased. Looking around into the endless desert, I wondered how many more lives or civilizations were thrown aside by what had occurred here. The field was endless, and I was sure there was a lifetime of memories buried beneath these grounds. The sky had giant, toxic brown clouds that dawned overhead. They held within their forms a sinister poison that scarred the lands and destroyed any creatures that was not sheltered beneath a hardened shell. They were the carriers of the new ruler of these lands, the messengers of his word, and they drowned out the star that once blessed this land with prosperity. At this pace, I would have never made it. I immediately stopped minding my surroundings and focused on the orb ahead. I ran as fast as I could, my feet picking up off the ground as they then skimmed across the sands with remarkable speeds. I split a canyon into the desert floor, the loose sands piling over one another to fill its wound. As I sped towards the growing tumor and the demonic life forms in the sand below, we shrieked as they could not steer out of the way in time. They shriveled into small balls of fire as I passed over them, and not even the savage birds above dared eat their liberated forms. I halted. Sand blew into the air at my sudden stop, and a large wave of the dried earth lifted into the air, crashing against the surface of the massive, decaying dome. It was a giant sphere, half buried in the deep sands, and it was made of dying flesh. I looked at it carefully from a distance as pus oozed from its crevices, drying shortly after its excretion, adding another hardened shell to the cancerous cell. It was a parasite, and it fed from this world relentlessly, converting the pleasantries that once existed here into more matter for its feeding. As I stepped closer to it, I could feel waves of negative energy radiating from it. I was alive, if it could be called that, and it grew in size as though it took in a deep breath. It sighed at my approach, and I placed my hand against it. A sharp alarm had sounded, throwing me back from the tumor as I heard a piercing voice that spoke a tongue foreign to my ears. It screeched a harsh warning. It did not want me. It did not want me in. My limbs shook violently as the voice slowly retreated from my head. It was terrifying. Even with the gifted confidence I had in this world, I could not stand to face that sound again. I needed help. I fell to my knees, clutching onto the sand below. I could feel her. I will not need you. I held the thought intently as sand gathered before me as though readying the entry of a greater being. It spun faster and faster, and I could vaguely see her form. I said I don't need you, I shouted, running through the spinning sands that formed a few feet in front of me, and the particles dropped back to the surface of the earth. I will not accept anything from her, not anymore. I had people who could help, people who would not punish me for asking. Falling to my knees again, I made up my plea.
I thought of him, the warrior, and the others who had to me in the past. I focused intently, reminding myself that I did not need her help. I wasn't willing to hear her offers, to suffer her consequences. I will do this myself, with the helps of my friends. Rising back to my feet, I was surrounded by people. They all looked around in confusion, picking up the sand in their hands and letting it fall between their fingers, as though the desert surrounding was entirely foreign to them. They stared intently at the glittering particles among the cursed soil, wondering what it was that had brought them here, to such a bland and deserted place. Many were dressed casually, as they always were, in whatever sleepwear, dress clothing, or preferred method of comfort they chose. They all were different one way or another, falling under different racial ethnicities, or holding their own original philosophies. They were all collected from different parts of the world, but the one thing they shared in common was that they all were human, and that was the one thing I had been looking for. One by one, they all found the pulsing, growing tumor at their back, and they all stared into its massive form with a look of shock. I ran to the back of the crowd, pushing my way through the people who blindingly stared up into the spherical scar. I continued running out into the sands to reach a greater distance, so that all will be able to see me. After feeling I had ran enough, I had turned and saw the back of the mass of people I had brought here, all mesmerized by the oozing orb. More were coming. I could see their forms phasing into the sands, falling under the same curious wonder as the others had, first looking into their hands, then into the sands, and then dawning upon the realization of the cancerous cell. I could not find him. I could not find the warrior or anyone of the likes. It did not matter, I thought, for I knew they were all willing enough. "Hey!" I had shouted, and the entire crowd had turned to regard me. They looked around at one another, starting conversations and asking what it was like I was doing here. They wondered why there was a boy out in the desert, and proposed such other nonsensical questions, not recognizing the oddity of themselves being here. I stepped forward, pointing over their backs at the buried sphere, which they all had already forgotten about. "We need to get rid of that!" I shouted. Their heads turned back to me as though my voice was projected at a volume that demanded the attention of its audience. I pushed out my finger again, emphasizing the fact I was trying to point out something to them, and they all turned as one to look at the tumor. I stepped into their ranks, the people parting as I walked by their side. "You want us to move that?" one man asked in exasperated breath. A great concern was done on his face, as though he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Destroy it," I had said, and the man straightened his back. He was in freshly ironed dress clothing and carried a pen in one of his hands. He began to loosen his tie. "Well, all in a day's work, sir," the man had said, as he undid the top bottom of his collar. He dropped the pen in the sand and began running, charging at the tumor as did every other person in the swarm. I stepped back, the roaring cries of the crowd escalating to deafening volumes as they all clumsily ran through the sand at the pulsing growth. Something terrible was forming, a great feeling of dread. As the first man made contact with the orb, he slammed a balled fist into its hard exterior, and the tumor tightened, shrinking in form and shaking violently as though in anger. Each person joined in, diving into the hardened shell, crashing their fists into its surface, or using whatever household objects they had brought with them into this world. The same shriek that I had heard earlier had returned, and it threw a sharp beam of red wind out from its shell that tossed back the infantile forms of the attackers, that hammered at its body. Unlike me, the people did not stand a chance, and their forms rotted away as they screamed in agony under the decaying odors of the tumor. Their bodies vanished as they returned to the reality they had come from, and more appeared to take their place. "Stop!" I had shouted, horrified by the massive death that was taking place. Men and women crawled back from the sphere as it drank in the death from the people around it, and it was only growing stronger. The people ran to me, falling onto their knees as they drew close, and they lowered their head in prayers, or sympathetic apologies for failure. "What do we do?" a woman cried to my side. I did not know what to say. I knew I had to get rid of this, whatever it was. It had to be killed, annihilated, taken from this world. I did not understand the death that I saw, and was not aware of what it did to the people whose astral lives were claimed. After resting my hand on the woman's shoulder, I ran at the tumor, summoning a speed no other being could dream of. I let anger fuel my course, and rage drove down my arms, bulging its forms in pulsating, blood-rushing aggression. I plummeted my arm into the tumor, its crust shattering at my hit, and my hand engulfed into its slimy interior. I pulled out as quickly as I could, frightened by the textures inside and green intestinal entrails spewing out of the hole, along with the slimy ooze that began to harden in order to repair the hole that had been made. I shouted out a curse, and I stepped backwards. I swore, again and again, in great frustration. All I wanted was the growth to be gone, ridden from these lands. The anger felt potent, and I could feel the edge of enragement soothing my soul. I called to it. I asked for its help. The sky broke open. The poisonous clouds parted as a dark hole ripped open into the stratosphere, and a great winged beast spewed from its bowels. Great winds were pulled from the earth, and the streams of sand were sucked into the air and into the black hole that demanded a feast to appease its summoning. The shadow of the winged beast dawned over the land, and the sand shook under the intense heat generated by its shroud. Gushing falls of lava was vomited from underneath its wing, bathing the barren sands in hot, raging coals that fell like meteorites to the earth. The creature made several graceful laps around the air as though it was taking its time before it looked down upon my form and descended into a dive. The people behind me scattered in terror as sand was blown up in every direction from the great flapping wings of the minion. The sands grew hot, and the fleeing crowd caught fire in their escape, burning into worthless ash that not even the growth would feed off of. It was the Primordian of rage. The Primordian had a gnarled face, a nose that turned and wreathed inside itself, and was made of a heavy steel as though it was wearing a mask. Its entire flesh was a solid, searing metal, glowing with furious runes as though it was just taken off a heated anvil. Its fingers were molted into blades, and they gripped into the ground as it lowered its head to mine, and curled a vicious smile into his face. It snarled at my sight, casting hot air out of its nostrils as it boasted its egotism from having somebody such as I call upon it for support. It was one of the greatest Primordians when it came to brutish, unyielding, and declarative power, and it would not let me go without knowing that and seeing it firsthand. Shivering off hot rivers of lava from its veins, the beast savored the anticipated duel, and it reeled onto its hind legs, lifting its arms high into the air and plunging them on the top of the tumor. I just sat and watched, knowing exactly what it was doing. It was communing with my every thought, fulfilling my open request, and the air was filled with waking waves of hatred, and the already acrid temperatures took a dramatic inclination in humidity. The dragon-like creature's anger was hideous, and its rage was afflicting. It demanded that I took part in the destruction that it was wrecking. It wanted me to drink from its emotions, and I found my teeth painfully clenched down and my hands rolled into balled fists with no sign of letting up. A great crack had sounded, and the beast tore open to the top of the shell like a hungry predator would the eggs in an unguarded nest. It gripped its ferocious mouth onto the edge of the spewing tumor, that fired gooey green slime out of the great wound, dousing the face of the demon in its acidic fluids. Fuming gases escaped from the melting steel across the face of the winged demon, but it cared little for pain. It tore at the tumor, ripping the giant shell in two and tearing it out of the ground, throwing it around in its mouth like a dog would a small prey. The shell of the tumor was flung a great distance across the desert, and the demon landed in the interior of the cancerous cell. I ran towards the opening, hesitating as I went to climb over the small, torn part of the sphere. The acidic interior fizzed as it touched the unspoiled air from the outside, but as my hand reached over it, the hissing liquid buffered to a harmless soup. I climbed inside, my hands unscathed by the now basic fluids that coated the interior. Conspirators. The world shook as I heard the words from cast down from the sky, as though the atmosphere itself had spoken. I continued to walk on, approaching the center of the tumor that was blocked off by the backside of the great Primordian. Its massive, twin tails swept carelessly around the tumor, knocking down long jointed ligaments that previously held the shell together. I stepped out long, not risking contact with the muscle-bound, spike-tipped limbs of the dragon beast. At the center of the tumor was a body, A fat and bloated cherubic corpse that sat strangled in a series of synaptic neurological cords that transmitted its every thought to the shell. It was alive, and its rotted face turned to stare at me with cursed eyes that seeped maggots out of its deep corners. The area smelt of death, and as the corpse opened its mouth, toxic gases escaped, poisoning the air, and even the snarling rage demon that was inches from its face curled back in disgust. "This was unnecessary," the cherubic corpse spoke in a hollow voice that I could hear both with my ears and from the inside of my head. "This was my host," it shouted, and the tumor writhed at its words, shaking violently and spewing toxins out of its veins. The winged demon growled back at the stung corpse, showing its displeasure in the tones that it spoke in. I had never seen anything like this in my life. Once I had seen such a winged demon in the distance, but never this close and never by my side. It was all so real and so vivid, but there was no turning back. I continued on my word that I would rid this world of this tumor, and if this primordian of incarnate rage would do it for me, then so be it. As though reading the words in my mind, the dragonkind, the beast of hatred, turned its flaring nostrils in my direction. "When he dies, one of yours will be mine." The sound was a deep, curdling, guttural demand that resonated with lifetimes of hatred. I did not know what it was asking, but I knew what it needed. It just wanted me to confirm it, to be reassured that I wanted this thing, this rotting creature, to be killed, that I wanted it to be taken from this world, and cast into whatever darkness it deserved to be in. It told me, in its vision, that this world would be free again, and itself would fly back to its black hole and leave the desert sands to bloom life again. It wanted nothing of this world. It said that it could be mine. That was all that I had wanted to hear, and so I nodded my head. I stepped back from the festering tumor and instructed the primordian to do it, to take the heart of the cancerous cell and end its existence here in this world. "You will regret this," the strung cherubic corpse slurred its words to me as I heard my agreement. "Son of Shal Ruahan." A warm sensation drove through my body at the sound of the words, and the foul odors that stank the air had vanished. The great, furious dragon smiled one last time, before it rose onto its massive legs and brought its giant jaw down onto the corpse within the center of the tumor. It tore the cherubic minion from the strings that bound it to the shell, and the entire fortress that it once hid behind melted into the ground in sinister pools of toxins. I could hear the maniacal laughter of the rage primordian as the world crashed into itself, and I faded quickly into a blinding light, returning to a reality where I sat solemnly within the inside of a bus. The dog was barking frantically, and I ran out of Betsy, grabbing my bike by the handlebars, and ran it towards the road.